It's about history. It's about preservation. It's about sense of place here on Eastern Long Island. With Esperanza Leon, I'm Irwin Levy, and this is Our Hamptons. Esperanza.
Hello, Irwin.
So we have a very cool guest today, Esperanza, I must say. And before I introduce the guest, I have to tell you, because I know you live for this. There's yet another great neck connection with our special guest.
I love it. I think we need to actually do an episode on just that.
It's amazing how Great Neck continues to rear its, whether we call it its beautiful head or its ugly.
Rear its head. Just no qualifier.
It rears its head, and I'm thinking we should segue and get the Met owner, since he was from Great Neck also, after we interviewed Joanne. But
oh my gosh. Well, and then we'll be a sports podcast.
Welcome to our Great Neck Sports Podcast. Yes, a segue from Our Hamptons. But we are excited to introduce Joanne. And by the way, because I am so old and feeble now, Esperanza, I actually write the name down on a big, in bold letters, so I don't forget. Joanne Friedland Roberts. Welcome, Joanne.
Thank you very much, Irwin, and lovely to meet you, Esperanza.
Likewise, Joanne.
Yeah, and
welcome.
when I grew up in Great Neck, I was Joanne Friedland.
Right.
And very quickly got introduced at age 14 to the culture there, where you couldn't wear any other shoes than Papagallos. And, it was so much like the Hamptons are today, with an emphasis on the way we look, our possessions, just kind of like the outer meanings of life rather than the inner meaning of life.
I will tell you, my wife moved to Great Neck with her family from Flushing, Queens, when she was 16 years old, and went from Bronx Science to Great Neck South High School. And since this isn't our Great Neck Recollections podcast, I'll just leave it by saying it was quite a culture shock and adjustment for her at 16 years old.
Me too, at 14.
Yes, okay, exactly. But the reason we have Joanne Friedland Roberts on the show today, Esperanza, is because of an amazing project she's doing. And this is a project that resonates so deeply with us.
Yes.
We've touched on it, Esperanza, on numerous podcasts. But why don't we just ask Joanne, it's the Bonackers Project. And Joanne, why don't you give us a little overview of what we're talking about, what it is, and then we'll delve deeper.
And how you got there.
Yes, most importantly.
Well, I can do a really quick segue to how I got there, which was, I started out as a teacher, and I've always loved sharing knowledge and information and bringing it into the community. And then I became a television producer and started creating educational content. And then I started an internet company in 1995, bringing together content and community. And so it's always really meaningful for me to create programming where I'm learning something new. The people who are watching it and involved with it are learning something new. And then we bring the community in as well. And so those are all aspects of the Bonackers Project. And just tell you what it is, and then we can go back to why I started doing it and became obsessed with it. So the Bonackers is a 60-minute documentary about the men and women who've been fishing and farming the land and seas out here for almost 400 years. They're the descendants of the first settlers. Life's really been getting harder for them every year in the middle of our very gentrified Hamptons, with government regulations making their life difficult, climate change, just all the added kind of pollution from all the people who are living here in the waterways. So that's the essence of the 60-minute documentary. I'm recording their stories, sharing their sagas, their wisdom, their struggles out on the water, in their farms, on their boats, in their homes. And it's been really an amazing experience for me, and one that I'm really excited about sharing.
Did you just wake up one day and say, "Hey, I want to talk about the Bonackers"? Like that's like how did that's the thing I'm trying to wrap my arms around here. How did you now? These aren't new stories. I mean, what your little dialogue just then. This is something Esperanza and I have discussed on this podcast numerous times. The sense of place, especially, and the Bonackers specifically. But did you wake up one day and say, "Hey, I want to document this in some way, shape, or form"? Like, how did you get to that point? Don't we want to know that, Esperanza?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, what you described before about content and community is kind of, it's like what you described is, I feel, what Irwin and I have been doing, aiming for. And all of this just aligns. But yeah, I mean, these are stories that we've continually been interested in. Is just, how did you get to that?
Yeah, and I'll come back to the community piece of this too. It's really fascinating to me. But well, I had a house at Louse Point. I've lived out here almost 40 years, part-time, and more recently, most of the time. And Louse Point abuts on Accabonac Harbor, and so I would watch the fishing boats. At that time, there were so many of them going in and out of the harbor every day, bringing back the fish that we were going to eat for dinner. And, I just was so captivated by the marine maritime way of life, and the fact that the fishermen just loved what they were doing so much.
As hard as it was.
As hard as it was, but they would never want to do anything else
because like breathing.
And still is their identity, and they all feel like they have salt water in their veins and want to be out on the water every day. And then my dad, I was telling Irwin earlier, my dad gave me Men's Lives. And, I started reading it, and, it was written in 1986 as an elegy to the baymen. And it was also created by Adelaide de Menil, who really was a philanthropist and photographer who put the whole project together. But so I I'll come back to that later, but I just started thinking about it so much. And then when I moved to Barnes Landing, which I love the piece that you both did on Barnes Landing Association.
That was fun, yes.
My next door neighbor is Dave Bennett. And Dave is really quintessential Bonacker. I mean, he's lived in the house next door for 85 years. His family's lived in it for way longer than that. His great grandfather was a whaler. Dave grew up with like one light bulb in the house, no refrigerator, walked to school every day. And, and he told me about the Bonacker culture. His ancestors came over in 1648 from Kent and Dorset in England. And, these families have been there ever since. And for Dave, when you should really meet Dave, he has a decoy museum.
I was just going to ask, is that the Dave? Yes, exactly. Yes.
Carves, decoys. My house is filled with them. If we were on video, I'd walk you around and show them to you. And he always brings over a new one, like for Christmas or something. But he's become a very good friend. And his son, Todd, raises chickens, sells eggs in front of the house, is a bayman too. He clams, he lobsters, he fishes, and he also does landscaping so that he is balancing all of these things so that he can support himself and his family. And Todd's son, Will, who's also Kelly Lester's son, is 21 years old, and he's still going to be fishing for the rest of his life. It's what he loves doing. So, that was really, knowing them was my earliest inspiration. And then, Dave introduced me to Susie Petakowski, who introduced me to Brent Bennett and introduced me to Albie Lester and Jimmy Bennett. And, and I've just gotten to know these baymen and record their stories. And, they just, what I love the most about the Bonacker community is they're so down to earth. They're so honest. They're so real. They love what they're doing, and they're going to keep doing what they do as long as they can. And, like I said before, it's gotten harder every year.
Well, that's, I think, the key line, what you just said, as long as they can. Now, if we go back in time, you brought up Men's Lives, which both Esperanza, I know, has read it. I've read it.
Yes.
I should probably read it again. It was a
It's the
phenomenal book.
the Peter Matheson
Ah,
book.
just
The event.
yeah.
There are people out there who are not familiar with this
Yeah.
really
And
amazing nonfiction book. Yeah.
yeah, and I mean, really, it was a tribute. I mean, Peter Matheson worked on the boats with them. I mean,
Exactly.
he really was living the life with them. But you go back into a timeline, of and we're going back 38 years to Men's Lives, 86. Billy Joel recorded the Downeaster Alexa in 1989, which became almost like a Baymen's anthem, if you will. And then Billy Joel and then supervisor Tony Bullock got arrested on the beach in Amagansett for halseining in 92. So, Joanne, I think the natural question here is, there was, and Esperanza, you could speak to this as well. I mean, they were struggling in 92,
Mhm.
between, the DEC regulations.
I was just going to say all the legal matters that
Right.
have come up.
The power
Which
of
continue.
the power of the sport, fishermen's lobby, and everything else. I remember Dan King at the time, who I don't think is out here anymore, was on that beach. I think he also might have gotten arrested. But I mean, going back again to 92, which 32 years ago, to now, I mean, the community was small then. And if we've, of course, have had the influx of even more mad money, the gentrification, whatever else you want to call what's happened out on Eastern Long Island. How has it changed from 30 plus years ago to now, Joanne?
Well, like you say, the numbers are dwindling, but dwindled very, very much. But, it's interesting when you talk about the legislation. So, the halseining crews were offshore fishermen. Most of the remaining fishermen in our community here in East Hampton, Amagansett, are inshore fishermen. But the halseiners, I mean, they're like I interviewed Arnold Leo, who was the secretary and treasurer of the Baymen's Association back then, and Don Eames, who was the president of the Baymen's Association. And, what Arnold said was that there was the commercial fishermen were pit against the sports fishermen. And the commercial fishermen, who are our fishermen out here, were very small in number, and the sports fishermen were wealthy, many more of them, and had many politicians on their side.
Right.
And the baymen had one politician on their side. So they kept losing in these legislation, even though Arnold and Don Eames kept going up to Albany to petition and to lobby for the baymen. But when the halseining industry was shut down, and the striped bass industry, which were the money fish, when that industry was shut down, things really started changing. So I did, Don Eames, who, I just mentioned, he had to leave because he first went to work in the school, and then he left and went to Texas. He was basically, tears were streaming down his face when I interviewed him. He didn't want to leave. He didn't want to give up that way of life. That was everything that he knew and loved, but he had to. And, most recently about today, I don't know if you've been, I'm sure you've been down at the town dock in East Hampton, but there are, so Brent Bennett, Jimmy Bennett, Danny Lester, and his brother Paul all have their boats on that dock. And they still go out from that dock every day fishing. And they have amazing stories to tell. I mean, Brent's been fishing since he was a little kid. I mean, he's 80 years old now. He has pound traps all out in the bay. And he loves what he's doing. And he's lucky. He's paid off his mortgage. His children are grown. He didn't want them to be baymen, and they're not. They work in other fields. But he loved his life, and he loved what he's doing. And when I went out to his trap, because I've been fascinated by the pound traps, he explained how they work and why he goes out on the water every day, because he wouldn't want to do anything else in the world. And Jimmy Bennett, who took us out clamming out of 3 Mile Harbor. I mean, I'm going to say he's in his mid 30s or late 30s. He's got 2 young kids, and he basically has to work at Riverhead Lumber too, to make a living. And what's happened is the eelgrass in the harbor has been destroyed by the runoff from the houses, the fertilizer, and the eelgrass, the nutrients from the eelgrass supported the clams. So that whole kind of
ecosystem, yeah.
right, the whole ecosystem exactly is changing. And
Yes.
and Danny's angry because his father was Calvin Lester, and the government has made it impossible for them to take the striped bass, that's the money fish, unless it's exactly to specifications of a certain size. And then
Yes.
they're tagged. And it's a certain number of tags that they can get every year. And if you look at these, rulers, they're ridiculous.
Joanne, every industry hates their regulators. Doesn't
Right.
matter if you're a bank, you're a law firm, or whatever. So these trials and tribulations are common in. I was in a
Right.
business that was regulated by the DEC also. Believe me,
Right.
there was no love lost either. So I sort of understand what you're getting at. But you bring up a lot of interesting points of how you seem to have a lot of interaction with the local community here.
Yeah.
And I know, we'll get into this. I know you had a big event. Esperanza, you might have been, were you at the event at Duck Creek when about the
I
Bonackers?
unfortunately had to miss it. I had a conflicting engagement, but I really would have loved to have been there.
And we're going to touch on that. I mean, I watched your trailer and I saw, I've
Yes.
seen the pictures of it. And I wasn't in East Hampton that weekend either, so I also
Yeah.
unfortunately missed it, which I would have loved to have been at that myself,
Yeah.
especially on Duck Creek. It's so symbolic that you even had it there.
Absolutely.
But you mentioned all of these interactions you have with the Bennetts, the Lesters, and Esperanza. Those names to us, and we've touched on this a million times, right from our first episode about Poseyville.
Correct. Yes.
This is royalty to us. This is Eastern Long Island royalty. Names like Lester and Bennett and everything else, and it
Miller.
does.
Yeah.
I mean, it is Esperanza. We've talked about this. I mean, it's painful, when a Lester or a Bennett has to leave this community. It hurts us deeply. So we certainly feel that. But Joanne, how did the community, when you started researching this and informing them of your project, did they embrace the idea universally? Did you have any kind of resistance to it in any way?
Yeah, I mean, yes to both of those questions. I mean, as I said, I'm very fortunate to have Dave Bennett as a neighbor and friend, and his friend Susie Pedikowski, who introduced me to Jimmy Bennett, and and Brent and Albie Lester, and then Prudence Talmadge Carabine,
Yes.
who's become a good friend too, and runs the East Hampton Historical Farm Museum. She introduced me to Don Eames, and she introduced me to Patty Sales, who introduced me to, to the other Lesters. So was there resistance? Yes, but I listened to their stories really carefully, and they know that I respect what they're doing, and they know that I'm going to tell their stories in a way that's meaningful and record their history, record their lifestyles, their wisdom, their knowledge, their culture, their traditions. And they're grateful for that. I mean, there's some people that I'd like to talk to who won't talk to me yet. And I need to get more people to introduce me to these specific people that I'm going to talk to.
Yeah, that's a question for me. I wonder, do you have a sense of why? I mean,
yes,
we can speculate, but why there is this, this sort of protective armor that certain people will surround themselves with? Is it like we don't want to be exploited, or we don't, in some way? I'm always curious about that, because I've had this in my own experiences where, and other people who are newer to the area maybe, or just maybe younger, or don't have the wisdom of just experience, don't understand that wall that some people will put up. And so I wondered if you have a sense of why that might be, and how we can break through it?
Well, I think part of it is, being introduced by friends, and then also continuing to reach out. So there have been people, there have been people that I've not had to, but that I've sat down with a few times before I filmed them. And, and actually when I started recording initially, I just recorded on my iPhone.
Right.
So that people didn't feel like there was a camera there, and it made it easier. It's a little trickier when I went out with a cameraman, and yet it was still me. You know what I mean? But there was somebody else behind. It just made it a little different. But I think the resistance that I've heard from these particular people that I plan to interview is, I've talked to people before. I've talked to media before. Nothing ever happens. Nothing changes.
Right.
And,
Yes.
Right. And so I've said, well, I'm not claiming that I'm going to change things. I don't have enough power to change things.
Right. You're documenting.
Yeah. And then the place where things may change is in these community conversations that I'm creating tied into the content. Because, like when you asked about the one at Duck Creek earlier, that we did a few things. I mean, we had the artists, we had Dave Bennett, we had with his decoys, we had Albie Lester with his wampum carvings, and we had Brent Bennett talking about his pound traps. But we also had, when you said Duck Creek is a really special place, Shane Weeks did a ceremonial blessing to the indigenous property that Duck Creek is on, because, the Shinnecock's and the Montaukets were here long before the Bonackers were here. I mean, the indigenous population's been here for thousands of years.
Yes. Then the Bonackers learned from them.
That's exactly how to build pound
learn
traps.
To survive from them.
Yes, absolutely. And they all know that about each other, and then, I led a panel discussion where we talked about at Duck Creek, the history of whaling. Shane talked about that. And then David Cataletto sang sea shanties from the whaling days. But we also talked about the issues. Arnold Leo was there, and Brent Bennett was there, and talked about what things are like now. But it's funny, Arnold, he didn't really want to talk about the issues anymore, because he said, what I love the most about this gathering is that you're bringing the community together.
Yes.
And right. And we have not felt this sense of community in years.
It's true. I think that's the part that, for me, people grieve the most about that.
Yeah.
And I know certainly I do. And I think Irwin can relate to that as well. So yeah, it's wonderful that you do that. But really, what do you feel, though, that, okay, you're bringing that community together, but is it rather like preaching to the choir? I mean, the idea of, we wish there could be more awareness and more like somehow that this would break through and people would understand this is an important history that can't be lost. The buildings can't be lost. The people can't be lost. The traditions can't be lost. How that's, I think, the frustration, right? And the grieving is about, well, it is being lost and nobody's going to do a darn thing about it.
No, absolutely. And, it's interesting, Esperanza, because it is, a community living a lifestyle that they're mourning while they live it, and there are not that many left. And, other than, let's say Will Lester, 21 years old, who's going to keep on fishing forever. I mean, who knows where things are going? And, it's weird. When I interviewed David Cataletto, who's a town trustee, he was talking about the fact that there is, a seaweed industry, kelp farming, that, that people, in fact, a woman whose name escapes me at the moment just got a license to be the first kelp farmer. And they're kelp farming on the Shinnecock.
Yeah.
Right. Mm-hmm. And there's some seaweed farmers out in Montauk. And so, that's like the optimistic side, if anyone in the community chooses to pivot, to use a word from the media industry, whatever, or the just industry, then there are some ways of sustaining what's happening. I mean, there's also the South Fork oyster farmers and Barley John Dunn and his group, and they're growing oysters in 3 Mile Harbor, and their oysters help purify the
Filter,
water.
yeah.
Yeah, filter the water. So, there is some hope for like the industry's evolving. And, I hope people will keep fishing. I mean, what would it's like Prudence said in my concept trailer, it's like people moved out here because of the farming and the fishing and the culture.
Bountiful land. Yeah.
Right. But
Right.
believe these are things we lament
Right.
all the time on our
They
Hamptons
originally
podcast.
moved out here for that
Right.
reason.
Right.
Now
And-
it's not so much that.
And you see the crazy things develop. Esperanza and I have talked about this. How people will pay a premium to buy land next to a farm field and then screen themselves away from the farm field. I mean,
Right.
you see all of this, and that was. I really liked what you said. They're mourning while they're living it, and that's really very true. I will. Part of what we do on our Hamptons podcast is we talk about the sense of place, the folklore of the place, if you will. And we've had that, we've lamented so many times how people here, they don't even know about the fishing history, the farming history. They don't know what a Bonacker is, but they know what Nick and Tony's is. I mean, we talk about
And they
this.
love farm to table, right?
They love farm to table, but they didn't realize, that they were Parsons farming this land, 200, 300 years ago. But so that's I shouldn't use the word frustration, but I will because I'm from Queens. It does frustrate me. And this history is a really valuable history to do. And I think, we do have to start wrapping things up. And, we'd like to know where you are with the project right now. I mean, are there any more, like the promotional event you did at Duck Creek was, again, I only heard about it third hand from you and saw it and spoke to some people that were there and raved about it. But are there any other events coming up? And in terms of the actual documentary, is there a timetable, like when you
Yeah.
have it released?
So, unlike other projects that I've done in the past, because I've always done my projects with a media company, so the funding has come up front. And this is the first independent documentary that I've produced. So I am fundraising and filming and fundraising and filming as I go along. And therein lies the rub, or that's the challenge, So the events that I did, and Irwin, you were talking about seeing the events, my website, which I'm just going to plug.
Please do.
Of course.
The Bonackers.com, www.thebonackers, BONACKERS.com. And, on my website, you can see the concept trailer. You can see some videos and images from the events that we did at Duck Creek and at the East Hampton Historical Farm Museum. And yes, I am going to be doing more events. And I am, and I'm also applying for grants. So like when we're done with the podcast, I'm going to go back to writing a grant that I'm working on now. And then I am filming and editing what I've shot. So the timeline, it really depends on how quickly I can raise the money. I would like, to say, oh, I'd love to have it at the Hamptons Film Festival next year. But,
Right.
The likelihood of that is small because I still have a lot of shooting and editing to do. And I want to do it right. I could just shoot the whole thing on my iPhone at some point, if I don't raise the money that I need in a timely way, maybe I will, because the new Pro Max 15 is, broadcast quality. But
Yes.
I'm working with a young cinematographer now, Julian Alvarez, and and Don Lenzer, who's an old friend, helped me put together the concept trailer. I mean, he recorded me doing my piece of it, and then and there are people who have really been helpful along the way. The Peter Matheson Center, like in collaborating on the events that we did together
Yes.
Daniela Kronmeyer and I produced those two events. And, and when we talked about men's lives, it was Adelaide Dumanil who really put the Men's Lives Project together.
Yes.
And we hired all the photographers. A lot of her photography is in the book. And she's given me access to the photographs. So that's a wonderful thing, her photographs to have as part of the project. And Jeannie DiLorenzo has given me all this wonderful historical archival footage from LTV.
I was just going to ask if you had, I guess they must have.
Yeah. Jeannie was the archivist there. She calls it their hidden archive because not that many people know about it. But it's, and that's why, as people listen to the podcast, any ideas about corporations, businesses, local people who would have some kind of shared interest in creating this documentary, in being part of it and getting the word out and being involved in the community events would be extremely helpful to me at this time, and
hey, Our Hamptons podcast audience, that's a Joanne Friedland Roberts coming right out with it and putting it out there.
It's an ask, people. It's an ask, and it's astounding
and honestly,
that there isn't more support for this endeavor. Actually, I think there are so many people, including Irwin and myself, who want to see something like this happen and more.
No, thank you. And I felt a little weird with the coming out with the ask, but I just wanted to raise that. And, and I did raise quite a bit of money at the events that I did. I just came out and said, hey, there's a donate button on my website. I hope you'll use it,
it's a story. Look, right now you are preaching to the choir being Esperanza and I, but look, this story, Esperanza, to say it resonates with us deeply would be probably the understatement of 2024 to this point.
Absolutely. I mean, what you're describing, I grew up with this. So it's to me, it's such a shame. I wanted to, before we close up, I mean, some people maybe might not have, they haven't, this is the first time they listen to an episode of Our Hamptons, or for whatever reason, might not know what a Bonacker is. Could you describe the history of the Bonacker, like just the word, where it comes from?
Oh, yeah. Well, the word comes from Accabonac Harbor because the original Bonackers came over, as I said earlier, from Kent and Dorset in England. And then they went through Gardiner's Island. Many of them work with Lion Gardner on that island, and then came to Accabonac Harbor. So, and the word Accabonac, I mean, one of the things that I heard is that it means root vegetable, because there were ground potatoes growing there that the Native Americans had grown. So the Bonackers, because they were mainly fishing out of Accabonac Harbor, became Bonackers, short for Accabonac. And they are those men and women who have been fishing and farming. And early on, that most of them were fishing, all of them were fishing and farming to survive, right? So they are descendants of that original family. So, okay, the name Bonackers, the name is evolved, right? So that now there's a football team at East Hampton High School.
Well, that's been decades. But yeah, exactly. Like ownership of Bonnack is in Springs, really, right? The Bonackers, the true Bonackers are from Springs.
Yes.
Yeah.
And Amagansett, I mean,
it overlaps,
but the name, yes, because like as Brent Bennett said, like he grew up in Poseyville, which you were talking about. And I can't wait to listen to your podcast about Poseyville. But, but they still consider themselves Bonackers because it's a way of life and an identity that, that old traditional way of life still being lived.
And
go Bonnack.
Go Bonnack. And remember one thing, Esperanza, that guy that came here from the Grand Concourse or Pelham Parkway when he was a month or two old, and lived here for 90 some odd years, his obituary will read Bronx man dies in East Hampton. So, in terms of what's a Bonacker and what's not a Bonacker, we touched on this. Esperanza went to the point, you couldn't even be born in Southampton Hospital. You better have been born in the house in Bonack, right? So,
Right. Yeah, exactly.
But Joanne Roberts, a big Our Hamptons podcast. Thank you for joining us and really telling a story, documenting a story that certainly deserves to be told. And for those of you in the community that don't know this history, Esperanza has mentioned this many a time on Our Hamptons podcast, delve deep because this place has a history really unlike many others.
Yes, of men and women. Yes.
That's correct.
Yeah. Yeah. And the East Hampton Historical Farm Museum is an amazing place.
Great. And we love
Yes.
Prudence. You
Yeah,
don't have to
Prudence-
sell. You don't have to sell us on her. She's top shelf.
No,
Joanne,
totally.
thank you so much.
And thank you, Irwin, and thank you, Esperanza. It's lovely
Pleasure.
meeting you both. Look forward to meeting you both in person. It would be great.
We would
Yes.
love
Let's have
that.
coffee or something. It'd be
We would
great.
definitely make that happen. And
Okay, good.
Esperanza, as always, a pleasure.
Always. Thanks for this journey.
Thank you both.
Okay. Thanks so much for joining us. New episodes of Our Hamptons are released every other Tuesday. Find them wherever you get your podcasts.